December 8, 1940. Winston Churchill sat down and wrote a letter. It was long, 18 sections, detailed, careful, but buried inside section 17 was one sentence that almost nobody talks about today. The moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. Read that again slowly. The British Empire, the nation that had controlled a quarter of the world's land surface, the country that had issued the world's reserve currency, ruled the seas for over 200 years, and built the largest empire in recorded human history, was writing to America, asking for help, because it had run out of money. By March of 1941, Britain had $68 million left in its accounts. $450 million in payments was due within 4 months. The Bank of England's gold reserves had nearly bottomed out. The most powerful empire the world had ever seen was weeks away from financial collapse. And here is what nobody tells you. Churchill already knew this was not going to end well for Britain. Not because of the war, not because of the bombs, because of something that had been quietly building for nearly 50 years before that letter was written. A shift in weight. Slow at first, then faster. And by December 1940, almost impossible to reverse. What you are about to find out is not the version of this story you were taught. This is the part that was left out. The decisions, the debts, the treaties, and the moments that explain why the world looks the way it does today. And it starts not in 1940. It starts in 1898. This is not just a story about two countries trading places on a map. This is a story about how one empire's financial choices, made under real pressure across nearly 5 decades, created the opening for another power to rise. War played a role. Geography played a role. Industrial strength played a role. But debt was the accelerant. And America understood that earlier than most people realize. To understand what happened, you have to see Britain at its peak first. In the late 1800s, Britain was the engine of the entire world. One nation controlled a quarter of the Earth's land surface. The pound sterling was the currency every country trusted. The Royal Navy was so dominant that in 1883, Britain alone had 38 battleships, while the rest of the world combined had 40. It was not a competition. It was a fact of life. British banks funded railroads in America. British investors held shares across 6 continents. Every major trade route moved through British-controlled ports. Britain did not just participate in the global economy. It ran it. Now, look at America in that same moment. Contained, turned inward. The Civil War had ended 30 years earlier. No overseas territory, no real navy, no weight in global affairs. The most powerful politicians in Washington were thinking about their own continent, not the world. Nobody in London was worried about America. That would turn out to be a mistake. April 21st, 1898. The United States declared war on Spain. The war lasted 113 days. When it ended, Spain handed America, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. A country with no overseas territories in January had its first colonial possessions by December. Theodore Roosevelt came home a hero. Within 3 years, he was in the White House. He called his approach the Big Stick. Speak softly, but make clear that America had the will to act in its own hemisphere. In November of 1903, his administration moved quickly to support Panama's independence from Colombia. Within days, the new government granted America the rights to build a canal across the isthmus. Canal rights in perpetuity. Roosevelt later told Congress, "I took the canal zone and let Congress debate." America was operating with imperial intent, but none of this yet threatened Britain directly. The pound still ran global trade. The Royal Navy still ruled the seas. Then 1914 arrived. When the First World War began, Britain did what it had done for generations. It financed the fight, not just its own war. It funded France, kept Russia in the field, paid for Italy's involvement. The empire opened its treasury and committed everything. By 1916, that treasury was empty. 2 years of industrial-scale warfare, had consumed more than Britain had accumulated in the previous decade. Britain turned to America for credit. American banks, led by J.P. Morgan and Company, organized large loans to the Allies. When the armistice came, in November 1918, Britain owed the United States approximately $4.2 billion. For the first time in living memory, Britain was a significant debtor nation. The country that had spent generations as the world's creditor now had a creditor of its own. Publicly, Britain had won the war. The empire was intact. Life carried on. But the financial position underneath had shifted in ways that would take years to fully surface. The first visible sign came in 1922. Britain and America signed the Washington Naval Treaty, establishing legal equality in naval tonnage between their two fleets. The Royal Navy, the dominant maritime force since the 17th century, was placed on equal footing with the United States Navy. Not defeated in battle, not dismantled by force, made equal by Britain's own signature. Britain agreed because the post-war debt had made matching America's shipbuilding pace financially impossible. What it represented was significant. The naval supremacy that had underpinned British global power for over 2 centuries was now formally shared. If this is the first time you are seeing this side of the story, you are not alone. Most people know Britain and America as close allies, two countries that stood together through 2 world wars. What most people never see is the ledger running underneath that alliance, the shifting weight, the quiet terms attached to every agreement. Drop a comment and tell us, did you know Britain had already begun losing ground before the Second World War even started? We read every comment, and we always reply. Now, back to the story, because what happened next is the part most people were never taught. When the Second World War began in 1939, Britain purchased American supplies in cash. No credit. You bring the money, you get the goods. Britain moved through its remaining reserves faster than anyone had publicly acknowledged. By late 1940, the cash was nearly gone. Roosevelt responded with Lend-Lease, signed into law on March 11, 1941. Britain could now receive weapons, ships, food, and supplies without immediate payment. But attached to the broader post-war framework was a condition that rarely appears in popular history. Article 7 of the Mutual Aid Agreement, signed in 1942, committed Britain to working toward a non-discriminatory international trading system after the war. In practice, this targeted the imperial preference system, the arrangement by which British colonies and dominions traded with each other at preferential rates, keeping outside competitors, including American exporters, at a disadvantage. The United States had pushed to open those markets for years. The war gave it the leverage to make that push formal. The post-war negotiations were complex and contested, but the direction was clear. Britain's financial dependence gave America real influence over the terms of what came after. And America used that influence to open markets that had been closed to it for decades. Britain was not simply borrowing money to survive the war. It was negotiating the post-war order from a position of serious financial weakness. July 1944. The war was still going. Normandy had happened 1 month earlier, but 44 nations had gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, because the people who understood power already knew. The country that designed the post-war financial system would hold advantages that outlasted any battlefield outcome. Britain sent John Maynard Keynes, the most respected economist of his generation. He arrived with a serious proposal, a new international currency called the banker, neutral, not the dollar, not the pound. A system in which no single nation's currency sat permanently at the center of global finance. It was a rigorous plan, built by a country that had spent 5 years borrowing its way through a war. America sent Harry Dexter White, and behind White sat the most powerful economic position at the table. The United States in 1944 was producing roughly half of everything the world manufactured. Its gold reserves were the largest on Earth. It was owed money by almost every major Allied nation. The negotiations ran 3 weeks. Keynes was 60 years old, physically exhausted, managing a serious heart condition. He argued with precision. People present later said he was still the most formidable mind in the room. It was not enough. On July 22, 1944, the agreement was signed. The dollar was pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency pegged to the dollar. International trade and foreign reserves would flow through the dollar. The New York Times the next morning wrote, "The American dollar thus obtains international recognition, on paper as in fact, as the world currency." Bretton Woods did not cause Britain's decline on its own. That process had been building for decades. What Bretton Woods did was formalize it. It gave the shift a date, a document, and a signature. The pound sterling, which had anchored global trade for over 2 centuries, was no longer the world's reserve currency. Keynes flew home. He died 18 months later. 1945. The war ended. America emerged as the dominant economic force in the post-war world. Its industrial base intact, its territory untouched. Its soldiers came home to a country more powerful than when they left. Britain emerged deeply in debt. Cities damaged. Treasury exhausted. Its capacity to sustain global commitments severely reduced. What followed was a long process of imperial withdrawal driven by multiple forces. Nationalist movements across Asia and Africa had been building for decades. The moral and political arguments against colonial rule had grown impossible to ignore, and the financial strain of maintaining empire was real and made every pressure harder to resist. India and Pakistan in 1947, Palestine the same year. Across Africa and Asia, over the following 2 decades, British administration ended. It was not one decision and not one cause. But money, or the lack of it, shaped the pace and the terms. For 61 years, Britain made regular payments on its wartime debt to the United States. The final payment came on December 31, 2006. $833 million. No ceremony, no headlines, just a transfer, quietly completed. Here is what this story is really about. Britain did not lose its position because it was weak. It held more global power for longer than almost any nation in modern history. What this story shows is how sustained financial pressure, compounding across decades, gradually closed off the options available to even the most dominant empire. Every major debt narrowed the room to maneuver. Every concession reflected limits that could not be escaped. Every condition attached to wartime assistance shaped the peace that followed. America did not conquer Britain. In many moments, it genuinely helped Britain survive. But survival came with terms. And across nearly 50 years, those terms moved in one direction. By July 1944, the country that began the century as the world's leading power was signing agreements designed by the country it had once governed as a colony. No invasion, no formal surrender, a pen, a signature, and decades of compounding consequence. That is the part of this story most people were never told. If you want more stories like this, the real version, examine the way it actually happened, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because there are a lot of things people think they already understand. And most of them are missing the part that actually matters.